Here we go. Colin O'Brady, explorer, record holder, summited the 7 summits, the Explorer's Grand Slam, an athlete, an adventurer, has crossed the Antarctic solo, and you're telling me that I can fulfill my dreams if I do 2 things: identify my Everest and go for a walk?
That's right. That's right, my man. You got it. I love it. You're squarely on there in just one day, too. It's not, invest just one day, conquer your mind, and unlock your best life.
Amazing. Amazing. Now, Colin, listen, first of all, as anybody who listens to my podcast will attest, you've already got like a willing buyer. You are the snake. Forgive me for this analogy. You're the snake oil salesman who just rode into town, and I'm the guy that buys every product that is sold. I did the 75-day hard challenge. I love anything that promises to better myself. But tell me how a guy who literally has done everything I just said, including many of which I want to talk about and hear the stories of, crossing the Antarctic alone. Tell me how a guy who's done all of those things and put in all of that work and all that preparation can tell me that I can change my life by simply going for a 12-hour walk.
Well, let's go into a little bit of an origin story, which combines a little bit of Antarctica, but also gets into how this applies to you, me, everyone on this planet. Which is, so I attempted in 2018 to cross Antarctica solo, something that no one in history had ever done, and unsupported, which means no resupplies of food or fuel. So I'm dragging a 375-pound sled behind me, and it's also fully human powered. So no kites, no dogs, nothing propelling me. And it ends up being this 54-day journey. If you've read any news articles about it, there was another guy who I was racing, this badass military captain named Captain Lou Rudd. We can get more into this, like one of the most badass humans on the planet. He kicks my ass in the first week. I eventually catch up to him. And as my body is declining, I'm telling you, declining. I could only, 375 pounds sounds heavy. It's full of food and fuel. I could barely, pull that thing on the first day. So much so that I was crying frozen tears. It's minus 30, minus 40 out there. I find myself, as my body is decreasing in strength, my mind is actually getting sharper. I know that sounds bizarre, but the silence, the stillness of Antarctica, and I'm pulling my sled every day for 12 hours, which again, just so we're clear, till we clear this out, what I'm suggesting other people do is not pull a sled for 12 hours across Antarctica. Don't worry. That's not where this is headed. And as I get into the last week or 2 weeks of that, I find myself in deep flow, just places in my mind and body where, whether if it's ball sports where you see Stephen Curry just, swish 10 threes in a row, or, you're just in that flow, right? It was just, I was dialed. My body, I had lost so much weight. My ribs were sticking out. My hips were sticking out. I had I was running a 3,000 calorie deficit every single day for 2 months. I was beat up. I had frostbite on my face, but my mind got stronger and stronger. And so as I eventually pushed that last week and had some, Herculean efforts in that last part to get to the end of my last bite of food, I felt amazing in my mind. I thought, wow, I've hacked this. I found this place in my mind of stillness and silence that also is full of fulfillment, love, joy, compassion, strength, power, all the things that I think most of us are looking for, peace, joy, etc. And as I get back to the United States and I do press and I meet, things like that, people are super interested in that. I'm like, I figured it out. Like I got my mind right at this crazy thing, and it was all about my mind. And I think I've got it like dialed. I row a boat across Drake Pass. I do some of this stuff. And then COVID happens, man. COVID happens. I think we all remember March of 2020, April of 2020, May of 2020. And my last book had hit the New York Times bestsellers list. I was doing a big book tour. Everything's canceled. I had an Everest expedition planned with my wife. Everything's canceled. And look, I'm not going to pretend like I had it the worst. People were dying, right? Like there's this negativity, this sadness in the world. And I'm sitting there in my house on the Oregon coast, my wife, my dog, for a couple of months. I imagine most people are locked inside, for this period of time. We know what this feels like. And I thought I had figured out this mindset thing. And I find myself depressed, anxious, full of fear, full of doubt. And my wife looks at me and she goes, Colin, you haven't gotten out of your pajamas in the last 3 days. Like I'm just sitting there on the couch, like doom scrolling the news, just like, absorbing all this intensity. It's an intense moment in the world's history, right? It's a bad moment in time. Still is, right? In some regard, but getting better. But that first couple months were tough. So I thought back, when was the last time I felt, strong and secure in my own mind? I said, it's crazy to think, but while I was pulling my sled, even most freezing my ass off in Antarctica, I actually felt better in my own body and mind. So I said to my wife, I said, hey, this might sound ridiculous, but tomorrow I am going to go on a walk all day. Don't worry about me. She just kind of looks at me like, she knows I do all this ridiculous shit. And she's like, yeah, fine. Like, have fun. So I walk out my front door the next morning at sunrise. 20 minutes in, my phone buzzes in my pocket. And I pulled my phone out to text whoever's texting me back. And I stopped myself. I'm like, I've been staring at my phone. I've been doom scrolling the news. I've been texting I've been Zoom calling my mom because I can't see anyone in person. Like, what am I staring at my phone? Like, put my phone in airplane mode. And I end up walking this day for 12 hours alone, in silence, no music, no podcast, no external inputs. And I get back to my front door on the Oregon coast. My wife looks at me and she goes, you're back. And I think she's talking about like, you're back. Like, you got home. It's dinner time, whatever. And she's like, no. I can tell. Like, you're back. And she was saying just my way of being. And I was like, well, if I'm being honest, I feel more calm, more at peace, more strong than I've ever felt. And I thought, okay, great. I'm the guy who walks across Antarctica. I pull my sled for 12 hours and I tap back into that. But as COVID goes on, as I think we all had, friends, peers, family members who are struggling. And so people would say, I'm not doing well, man. I'm struggling. I'm stuck. I'm having a next decision point in my career, whatever different, people are struggling with this. And I started telling people, well, I did this thing and it had a big impact on me. I didn't know if people would take me up on it or not. And all sorts of people, first in my community and then sharing it, young, old. My 77-year-old mother-in-law does the 12-hour walk. Her 12-hour walk was one time around her block, sit on her porch quietly for an hour, take as long as a break, and walk around her block another time. It doesn't matter how far you go, 1 mile, 50, take as many breaks as you want. But the concluding of this thought, this origin story is every single person I have known to take this 12-hour walk has come back in a mindset that is drastically improved. In a noisy world where we're constantly bombarded by texts and internet and all this. And I'm not vilifying that. This is for you to figure out how to integrate in your actual life. I'm on my phone, I'm on my social, I'm on podcasts. I love the internet. But to take one day in that stillness, in silence, the amount of growth that I have seen in people from all different walks of life, all ages, all strengths of ability levels, it is a rewriting of one's mindset in just one day. And that's at the core. That's what the book is about. The book is about adventure, but that's the core take home from it. But my goal is to inspire 10 million people to take this 12-hour walk because the ripple effect of strength and positivity, I've already seen it. And it's just growing. It's amazing.
Well, I can attest that you have 9,999,999 to go because I will take the 12-hour walk. I promise you. And I certainly, for what it's worth, I meant no disrespect, and I think you surely knew that when I said if you were a snake oil salesman. What I think you're selling is clarity, and I'm always someone who wants to buy into bettering myself. And in this book, The 12-Hour Walk, you walk through all of your great adventures and how they can apply to each and every one of us and how they may apply to this 12-hour walk. And so many of the things you just said and you wrote about, I feel like intersect with some of my life experience. And I want to ask you about many of those. But my first question then is going to be something you just said. You brought up the concept of flow. I am fascinated by flow. You brought up Steph Curry. I'm a sports fan. I'm a father. I've actually seen when my sons are in flow. It's like a constant pursuit in my life to find flow, and that's been described as various people as when you simply lose track of time, when you're in a productive mindset, when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing here on this earth. Do you think when you did that walk, and I think you alluded to this, you were just in your flow? Because again, you did 12 hours a day in Antarctica. You are someone who likes to push his own physical limitations. Or is it a way for me to tap into my flow, whatever that may be?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll answer that question from two standpoints. One is, I say that I believe that we all have a masterpiece that we can paint inside of us. And it just depends on what canvas you want to paint on. My canvas happens to be the ends of the earth and mountaintops. And I don't blame you if you don't want to go freeze your butt off in the middle of Antarctica by yourself. Like, I get that part of it. And so in that context, I don't necessarily think that adventure is the key to unlocking everyone's own fulfillment. I think that is through different doors. That said, why the 12-hour walk itself is potent, not the 12-hour walk in Antarctica pulling the sled, but the 12-hour walk that takes place at your front door, right? Is that there are some pretty deep human truths that we have lost sight of a little bit in modern society. We've gained so much, right? But there's lost sight of a few things, which is for thousands of years, we spent more time outside. For thousands of years, we didn't have constant bombardment of dopamine hits from things like smartphones and things like that. For thousands of years, we were bored at times, right? We had our mind, the ability to process, to think, to engage. And so walking, although you might apply the lessons from that to, whatever you're pursuing, art, music, culture, impact, love, family, etc., not to pulling a sled across Antarctica, the flow of walking is a universal that crosses, socioeconomic status, that crosses race, that crosses culture. And if you really look, historically through culture from, all sorts of different cultures, across the world, across time, there's been a lot of rituals that have to do with walking, vision quest, questing. There's all sorts of Buddhist traditions around walking meditations. I don't care what you call it. There's a lot of people over a lot of duration of time, because it is just, we were hunter-gatherer society, right? We were a walking, moving species for a very, very long time. So there's something pure and primal that this taps into. And your flow might be different than my flow, or how we apply these lessons, moving lesser, might be applied to a different canvas. But walking is this universal way of connecting with ourselves, for sure, for everyone.
I love that. In order to find flow, get into the process of the flow of walking, which has crossed generations and crossed millennia. So I want to talk about some of your stories, and you can tie them into sort of what you have to share with us. It's not just about your life, but applies to ours as well. But I may ask you about some specific moments that intrigued me in reading your book. So you alluded to one of them just a moment ago. You're in Antarctica. You've had these first couple of rough days. I think you're putting together 10-hour-day walks. You're getting beat by this Special Forces officer. It's a race, but you arrive at a moment where you see each other. And this is where, the way I read it, Colin, is your competitive nature kicks in. You can tell me why you decide to go from 10 to 12, but I really am fascinated by the face-to-face meeting. I mean, I guess in that moment, and then you walked, it sounds like you walked side by side to some extent for quite some time. Do you think you just won the battle of wills there on who was more competitive and who was going to stop first day by day?
Yeah, no, it's a really intense moment. One of the most intense moments for my entire life. A brief bit of context is I tried to do this. I was planning to do this thing that no one in history has ever done. Right? I trained for it for a year. I raised sponsorships. I do all the planning, the training, pack my sled, whatever. I'm getting ready to go. I do an interview with the New York Times that says like, "Hey, I'm going to try this thing that people say is impossible. I might fail. I might succeed, but I think I'm going to be successful." Unbeknownst to me, at the exact same time, the same story is playing out in the UK, which Captain Lou has been training for a year. He doesn't tell anybody. And then right before leaving, he takes an interview with the Telegraph in London saying the same thing. I'm going to be the first person in history to cross Antarctica solo, unsubordinated. And we find out about each other just before we're departing. And what people don't realize often, they're like, "Oh, you must have planned this as a race." We didn't plan it. There is one guy in Antarctica with a plane that can drop you off on the edge of the frozen continent, and there's only one time of year that you can do this. So unbeknownst to the two of us, we both call, of course, the one guy and make the logistics for the exact same day. So we are literally sitting shoulder to shoulder in a cargo plane, getting flown to the edge of the frozen continent, going, "Oh, so we're not racing history." And this guy is a badass of all badass. This guy is like the British equivalent of a Navy SEAL. He's really experienced in Antarctica and the polar travel way more so than I am at this point. And he looks me in the eyes. Us in the U.S., we don't have a long lineage of polar exploration for whatever reason, but it's been a huge part of British tradition going back 100 plus years to the likes of Ernest Shackleton and Captain Scott and just historic British figures of exploration. And he looks at me in the eye and he goes, "Kid, it should be a Brit who cracks this journey first." Like, he's just like, "What the hell are you doing here, you stupid American kid?" So anyways, he kicks my butt on the first day. He kicks my butt on the second day. He's long gone. I'm having frozen tears and battling with my own mind just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But I do, to my complete and utter surprise and a whiteout, catch up to him on the sixth day. And I can't believe it. And in a whiteout in Antarctica, it's very disorienting. It's white in every single direction. Imagine closing your eyes and walking down a dark hallway. You're going to smack into the wall pretty quickly because, as humans without visual cues, we can't walk in a straight line. So the only way to walk is to stare at a compass strapped to your chest. And so I try to sneak past his tent. And as I'm sneaking past, I hear this cough and this unzipping of the tent, and he sticks his head out in the whiteout, and he kind of starts like slowly waving at me, almost like he's on like a parade float, or he's like the King of England or something, like waving at me. And I'm like, hey, don't mind me. I'm just going to like keep going, whatever. And so I keep going this whiteout for a couple hours. And I eventually, I'm staring at my compass. It's really hard to navigate in a whiteout. It's way slow going because it's 2 steps to the right, 2 steps to the left, adjust the compass needle, whatever. And I look behind me, and there's Captain Lou behind me. No compass. He's just using me to navigate, going straight in my tracks, just letting me navigate him forward. I'm like, shit, this guy's messing with me. So I finally slow down, force him to come up to me, and he says, hey, Colin, I've got a bit of a suggestion for you. I'm like, a suggestion? Like, this guy's already in my head. He can't possibly be saying anything nice to me. We're trying this, this guy's a trained killer. And I stop him short, and I say, Lou, no disrespect. The guy who had attempted this a couple years before us died out there. We both know that the stakes are really intense. I was like, I'm not wishing you ill will, but this has become a race. We're supposed to be out here alone. Let this be the last time we speak. And he says to me, he pulls up his mask, and he just stares me in the eye, and he just goes, suit yourself. That's all he says. As if he was about the suggestion he was going to give me was like unlocking the greatest key of, whatever this is. And then we're in this moment. So we're in this moment. We're like, fine, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I'll see you later. We're both pulling 300 some pounds behind us. So see you later. It's like 2 tortoises, like saying they're going to sprint apart from each other. It's like, I'll see you later. And there's like walking right beside each other, like shoulder to shoulder. We're trying to go in the exact same direction. None of us is going to try to add any distance to this thing. Before we know it, 4 hours goes by. He's still right on my shoulder. 5 hours goes by. I'd had the sat phone call with my wife a couple of days before where I had said, 10 hours is the absolute maximum my body can ever go. She's like, if you're going to catch up to Lou, you might have to go farther. I'm like, and that's our limiting belief, right? That's us saying in our own minds what our limits are. She goes, you might have to try to go a little further. She's trying to encourage me to, get back in this race before this. And I'm like, I yell at her, not because I'm mad at her, but just like I'm frustrated with myself. 10 hours is like the limit of humans' capacity to pull a sled in Antarctica. There's no freaking way I go any faster than that. And I'm like, that's in my mind. 8 hours goes by. Lou's still right next to me. 10 hours goes by. Lou's still right next to me. 10 hours goes by. 10 hours, 15 minutes. 10 hours, 30 minutes. He's still there. And I say to myself, you're 100% right, Will. Your question. Did my competitive spirit get the juice from me? I was like, I am not letting this guy finish this day in front of me. This is I decide emotion. We're still like 900 miles from the finish. It doesn't matter who finishes day 6 ahead of the other one at all. But it did emotionally to me. And 11 hours goes by, and I see Lou stop and pull out his tent from his sled, and I think, I've got him. I've got him. I am so exhausted at this point. I'm an hour past what I think the full limits of my capacity are. But I promised myself I'm going to go 1 hour further, and I drag my sled for 12 hours. And I get in my tent that night thinking, was that just one push? But there was a recalibration in my mind. All of a sudden, I was like, well, if I can do 12 hours one day, could I do 12 hours tomorrow? Could I do 12 hours the next day? And I go 12 hours every single day without taking a single break for the next 48 days and end up finishing just a couple days ahead of Captain Lou and becoming the first to complete this crossing.
Well, and on the note of your competitiveness, he may be special forces, but it's good for the listener to know as well. I mean, you had college offers to play soccer and swim. You swam at Yale. You're a triathlete. You are an endurance athlete. So you had that competitive fire
100%. I'm not going to pretend like I did
before you got into this. Right.
For sure.
Hey, I want to, and so again, I want to touch on a few more of your stories and the lessons that are applicable, but I also have just my own curiosity. I just finished a few months ago reading Endurance, the story of Ernest Shackleton, which several of your adventures actually tie into that story, including Antarctica and the Drake Passage. But what was the terrain like? In reading Endurance, and of course, there's different parts of Antarctica, but it seems like you randomly encounter, at least on the edges, ice flows that mount into mountains, and even when you're on Antarctica, it's not flat. So I'm listening to you talk about pulling this 375-pound sled. What is that? And also having to 2 steps left, 1 step right. Like, what is that walk like?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, shout out to that book, Endurance. It's one of my all-time favorites for those 5. It's not, you don't have to be interested in exploration or adventure. It's just a badass story of leadership, of strength, of perseverance. Like, there wasn't a day that I went by when I was pulling my set across Antarctica I didn't think about Ernest Shackleton, thinking this guy was out here 100 years ago. No GPS, no Gore-Tex, no, sat phone back to his wife. This guy is out. These guys hanging it out there, and that whole story is insane. How they survived that, all of that. So they were on the exterior. They were trying to get to the interior of Antarctica, but their boat got shipwrecked on the exterior. So they're on the sea ice, and it starts, as you know, it freezes around their boat,
right.
It causes a bunch of problems, whatever. The exterior of Antarctica, which when I rowed a boat, I rowed this boat across the Drake Passage, which is a whole other crazy, wild adventure. 40-foot swells in a tiny rowboat, no motor, no sail, just getting beat on by the most intense ocean in the world. That was a whole other adventure. There's sea life out there. There's tons, right? Penguins, whales jumping beside my boat, all sorts of teeming sea life, icebergs, all this amazing stuff to see. The interior of Antarctica, where Lou and I were crossing once we got, deeper into the continent, there's nothing, man. Like, there's literally nothing. The South Pole's at 9,000 feet, and the coast is at, obviously, sea level, which means we were slowly pulling our sled uphill. But for about 500 miles, that was about at 1 or 2% grade. So imperceptible, enough to perceive, like, it makes it harder to pull your sled, but you can't even barely see it up. Like, your brain can't really compute the vastness of this endless white landscape. But there's no mountains. There's, on the interior where we were, no mountains, nothing alive, no plants, no animals, no bugs, nothing. It is just this white on white on white endless landscape, which is intimidating to say the least. And when we were there during the Antarctic summer. Again, it's minus 30 instead of minus 100 in the Antarctic winter. And it's minus 30 with a 50 mile per hour wind, minus 70 wind chill. But the sun is directly overhead for us. So the entire day, 24 hours of daylight with the sun at basically high noon. So you're in this like white room that feels like it wants to kill you. And then our brain is used to computing the change of shadows and the day and the night and those cycles in our circadian rhythm. And there's none of that. It is high noon, 24 hours a day in this endless white box that feels like it's trying to kill you. It is a deep journey into the mind, body, and soul. That's for sure.
So, and you brought this up, and by the way, we'll ask this question now because we're talking about Shackleton and endurance. In reading that book, the scariest part of that book to me was the final push in the rowboat back to civilization with Shackleton and a small part of his crew, which they intentionally tried to avoid the Drake Passage, if I remember correctly. My memory may not be exact, but that is the separating, I believe it's the separating sea between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and the two come together, and it's massive waves, and it's just, two worlds literally colliding, and it's terrifying to envision. And you decide to row across that, and I don't know if it's the scariest thing you ever have done, because you've climbed Everest, you've trekked across Antarctica, but I do believe you wrote that it's the most uncomfortable thing you've ever done. Yeah,
so... we get this harebrained idea to row a boat across the Drake Passage. It's never done before. Ends up being a team of 6 of us. And we're on this tiny 28-foot rowboat. And you're correct. It's the southern tip of South America to the Antarctic Peninsula. And it's the convergence of not only the Atlantic and the Pacific, but also the southern oceans. And so these 3 ocean currents are combining into this. I mean, it's far in terms of seafaring, it's 750 miles, but relatively narrow, big ocean currents funneling through this, 750-mile channel, which creates really unpredictable currents. To put that in context, Shackleton, these guys are out there. They were in the Weddell Sea on the edge of Drake Passage, but as you said, trying to avoid Drake Passage, but similar, very similar, icy, brutal, cold waters. We're trying to row a boat across Drake Passage. There's commonly 40-foot swells, which we experience. There's icebergs. There's every bad thing you could possibly imagine has happened in Drake Passage. Not only is that the case, but how do I say this? The currents, because there's no predominant current, it's these 3 oceans converging. It's just this massive nightmare of water in any different direction on any given day. In modern context, this isn't like 100 years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that. A cruise ship sunk in Drake Passage because the waves were so big. We're talking about a freaking cruise ship. So we decided to go out there in a 28-foot rowboat, open hull, 2 feet off the water. Fortunately, the thing self-rights, which means when and if it capsizes, it actually just hopefully rolls back the other way and you come face up a minute later or something like that. And it was definitely some of the most terrifying of my life. You talk about discomfort, and one of the, opening chapters of the 12-hour walk, I talk in more depth about this journey. But the lesson of that is this limiting belief of I don't like to be uncomfortable. I don't like to be uncomfortable. And on the Drake Passage, it's one thing to row a boat, it's one thing to be afraid or whatever, but wet and cold and sleep deprived, I mean, that is like the worst combination for humans basically possible. And we put 6 guys on this rowboat because we needed the manpower to push it through these intense conditions. But this rowboat was actually only built for 4 people, 2 people rowing at a time, 2 people taking breaks. And when I say breaks, we're taking 90-minute breaks. So 90 minutes on, 90 minutes off for continuously. And there's these 2 tiny little holds. Imagine like like the trunk of a Honda Civic, a trunk of a small sedan. Like that's the hold. And so when you're in there by yourself taking your break, it's 40-foot swells. You're banging around in the trunk of a Honda Civic, just holding on, waiting for your turn to row 90 minutes later. But a few times the storms got so bad, the swells were so big and against us, we're getting beat up that we actually don't think it's safe to stay on the deck anymore and to try to row against these swells. So we abandon our ability to row and we throw out what's called a sea anchor, which is like a parachute basically that tries to hold you into place. And then we're like, we got to get inside the holds. But now imagine being in the trunk of a Honda Civic with another grown-ass man getting thrown around in 40-foot swells, or the other hold, there was 4 guys in maybe the trunk of a 4Runner, a slightly bigger car. So there's a 6'2", 6'3", jacked dudes, wet, cold, no tired. Now for 25 hours with no windows, you're locked inside of the trunk of a car, but you're in the middle of Drake Passage and you know that, and you're getting thrown around the most violent ocean currents. That, talk about uncomfortable.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and the lessons of the 12-hour walk, which you apply your lifetime adventures to, is overcoming your limiting beliefs. And I do want to talk about a few of those, but you touched on this one. I do think we've arranged modern life to maximize comfort at all times, and maybe it's even better said to minimize any exposure to discomfort. And so, is your argument for us then that we should be bursting that bubble? We should be seeking discomfort?
Through the lens of that story, and the reason I share that story, other than to, entertain you with my discomfort, sometimes it's fun to watch somebody else suffer, right? So hopefully it's at least entertaining from that standpoint, because there's plenty of suffering in that moment. I actually love a phrase, pain is mandatory, but suffering is optional. So you kind of get to choose how you react to that, which leads me to this next sort of thought, which is, I've come to think about life on the scale of 1 to 10, the experiences of life. 1 being our lowest low moments, being in the Drake Passage, hanging on for dear life, wet and cold and sleep deprived, that's a 1. Or some of the moments I said crossed Antarctica, being alone, afraid, frozen tears on my face, or other things from my personal life. There's, I burned myself in a fire in Thailand, was told I would never walk again normally. Other elements, just low lows. And 10s are the high highs, right? 10s are reaching the summit of your own Mount Everest. In my case, Mount Everest. Whatever that is, achieving something, or the day your first child is born, or falling in love. These are peak moments. 10s. We want the 10s. 10s are amazing. They're like the best of the best, right? I've come to think of life on the scale of 1 to 10. But when I think about of all the 10s that I have, so in this case, getting to the shores of Antarctica in the rowboat, we did it. We were the first. We made it through these storms and we got there. And that was a 10, right? Like, holy shit, we did it. We rowed a boat across Drake Passage. I realized that my 10s and my 1s are connected, meaning every time I've experienced a 10, it's because, not in spite of my 1s, but because of my 1s, because of my willingness, my ability to experience the full tapestry of life. And as you mentioned, in our modern society, I think too often, and where people get stuck, they aren't living the fulfilling full life that they want to. They get stuck in what I call the zone of comfortable complacency, this zone between the 4 and the 6. It's like, you got a job, you go to work, it pays the bills, you don't hate it, you don't love it, it's fine. It's just, but you're doing it every day. 5, 5, 5, 5. Or, maybe you're, in a long-standing relationship. It's not toxic, it's not abusive, it's not bad, it's nothing like that, but it's just like, you're cohabitating, whatever that is, just like 5, 5, 5. Like, we have the ability in modern society, as you said, we have solved for comfort. We have solved for just like the 5. And the reason people are in that zone of comfortable complacency more than anything, I realize, is people are hedging against the 1s. They're hedging against the 2s. They're saying, I am going to do everything I possibly can to not experience a 1 or a 2. And this is a silly metaphor, but you're sitting in your house, you go, I want a kitchen remodel. I want new appliances. I want this thing to be sparkly and shiny, new floors, new backsplash, all the cool shit. Well, what's the first thing you do? You rip out the plumbing, you rip up the floor. Like, it sucks. All of a sudden you don't have a kitchen in your house. Like, it gets worse before it gets better. So my point is, to experience those 10s, you have to be willing to take on those ones. And I'll finish that thought by saying, the Antarctica, if you took me in a cruise ship across Drake Passage, which actually I have done, and it's beautiful and it's amazing. It's how most people experience Antarctica, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend it. So this is not me knocking that at all. And when you get there to Antarctica, it's a 7 or it's an 8 maybe. It's amazing. You're like, oh my God, Antarctica, it's amazing. But for me, it was a 10 because I also allowed the ones, the suffering. It wasn't easy for me to get there. And so life's peak arcs are connected to the ones. And so the 12-hour walk, the actual exercise of it, that pushback of, I don't like to be uncomfortable. I can't be alone in my thoughts. What's going through your mind? I don't like to be alone in my thoughts. My feet are going to get tired. I'm going to get this. Yes. But I have known people to do the 12-hour walk, and most people experience some 1, 2, or 3 along the way as they're frustrated, thinking, why the hell did I turn off my podcast and music and want to walk for myself? My feet are tired and it's hot. What the hell am I doing out here? Every single person that gets back to their front door is at the 8, is at the 9, is at the 10. They are not in their day-to-day life. They are not in their comfort zone. They're not just living another 5. Think of how many days in your life for the past year that you can't even remember. What'd you do last Tuesday? What'd you do last month? What'd you do, 2 months ago? You will remember this 12-hour walk, and it will imprint as a peak experience of growth, of fulfillment, of depth, and the ripple effect of positivity from that is vast.
I love the 1s and 10s. I have a friend, my co-host on Fox and Friends Weekend, Rachel Campos Duffy, who is a devout Catholic, and she has preached to me the virtue of suffering. We've had some very philosophical conversations during the commercial break, and we've talked about how life should pass in old age, and she has preached to me the virtue of suffering, but I don't think I've rationalized it in the context that you just did, that you can't have 10s unless you're willing to find or survive 1s. So how about this? A little bit more superficial. You set this up, so you've rigged the game. You have made it a 1 to 10 scale. But if I blow up your framework and I ask you, climbing Everest, climbing any of the other summits, rowing the Drake Passage, hiking across Antarctica, which one of those is the highest? And you can't say they're all 10s. Yeah. One of them's a 10.5. Maybe one's a 13. Which one's the highest?
It's funny. It's one of the least. So I sit here humbly with 10 world records. And I've had some amazing experiences out there, and they've all, of course, I'm not going to do this, but they're all great in their own way, and they have been. That's certainly true. But if I have to rank them, the one that actually is the highest for me in my mind at this point is one where I didn't set a world record. It's not one of my 10 world records. It was last year, on June 1st of last year, I summited Everest with my wife. My second time up there, wasn't a part of a world record project. She was way out of her comfort zone and depth. And I talk about in the book how she wasn't necessarily perfectly prepared and fought through her own limiting beliefs. But that experience, being up there at the top of the world, I think there's only been 5 married couples ever in the history of Everest. She was the only 87th American woman to ever summit Everest, ever in the history of the mountain. But to have that experience together with the person that you love, with the person that you care about, talk about vulnerability, talk about trust, talk about intensity. It was all of those things. But that summit, that hug and that frozen kiss on the summit, looking out over the rest of the world, that was the 10.5. That was the 13, to have that experience, in that moment together.
There's something deeper there as well, about the concept of achievement and the importance of connection. But I'm going to stay superficial instead of diving, as I want to, into the depth. I'm going to stay superficial for a moment. Among these achievements, and I just want you to limit it to your achievements now, which one is the one you don't want to revisit because it was so difficult, or maybe it wasn't as rewarding, and maybe it wasn't a 1. Maybe it was even a 10 among all of those, but it was the least among the achievements. Which one is the one you do not want to do again for whatever reason?
It's a tie, maybe. Can I say a tie? I'll tell you, Brian, both ways. When I was on day 35 of crossing Antarctica, which in the end has been one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life. Something I'm extremely proud of. I called my wife from a satellite phone. We do a few of these safety checks now and again just to make sure I hadn't completely lost my marbles being alone in Antarctica, wandering around by myself. And I say to her, honey, if I ever tell you from the warmth of our own bed, our own home, that I want to walk across Antarctica by myself, make sure that you smack me and tell me that is the worst freaking idea ever. I was like, don't ever let me convince myself that this is a good idea. I literally said that in the moment. I go, there might come a day, 5 years, 10 years from now, when I'm sitting inside, I'm thinking, God, I need an adventure. I'm going back to Antarctica to walk across solo. I'm like, make sure to remind me of this conversation. The other one that's a tie would be, I mean, it's so funny, but then in the end it was amazing. But the Drake Passage was amazing. And fulfilling and deep and powerful, and it's so unique in all these ways. It's tough, man. 6 people in that cramped quarters. Like at the end, like we mostly went away as deep friendships, but like the human element of that was also really intense. You know, and like I said, like these guys are brothers. I mean, like these are guys that like I love, but like that's an intense human experience to share with others, and the emotion. There's something about being alone that's hard, but you're like, you know, it's you and you're battling with yourself. There's also like when you add 5 different, you know, just different personalities into the mix. In the end, I'm so proud of us. I mean, like I said, we're proud to do it together, but that was tough, man. That was definitely pushing out some edges as well. And then those moments.
Out of curiosity, are you more of an individual sport guy than a team sport guy? You had that choice, right? You could have been a college soccer player or a college swimmer. And by the way, in a minute, I'm going to draw way too many parallels between our lives, but I was a swimmer all throughout my life growing up.
Cool.
Played water polo in college because I wanted to play team sports. My wife was also a collegiate swimmer. My sons, who are probably genetically predisposed to be swimmers, I have discouraged it because I wanted to be around teammates, and they're soccer players. They're all in on the other half of your life. So I'm just curious, is it you chose swimming over soccer? Are you more of an individual sport guy?
It's funny. I'm not. I'm a massive extrovert. I'm the youngest of 7, 5 older sisters. I love team sports. And I was nationally ranked in both swimming and soccer growing up. I do think that I can't say never, but I think I'm more likely to have walked across Antarctica solo and done some of the things I've done because of swimming. Because as you know, as a swimmer, head down, you know, sensory deprivation tank, staring at a black line. I mean, it's a grind, man. Talk about something that builds mental strength and mental endurance. But the actual decision point came for me is that it was somewhat of a toss-up as I was headed off to college. But funny enough, I skipped 3rd grade, and I was already young for my grade. So entering my senior year of high school, I was 16. And I was getting recruited nationally in both sports. But in soccer, it was proving a little bit harder because club soccer is mostly where the recruitment's coming from, not from high school. And my peers, you play in your age group. And so they were all juniors in high school, and I was a senior in high school. And so the coaches were like, yeah, we're recruiting you guys a year from now. And I was like, well, I'm a senior. I'm actually going to college next year. And so it actually proved, although I was still getting some regional recruitment from, you know, what then was the Pac-10. Now I guess it's back to the Pac-10 now with UCLA and USC leaving. I don't know if they're going to rebrand that thing. I was getting, you know, regional recruitment, but the national recruitment, you know, in terms of the East Coast, the Ivy League, you know, stuff like that wasn't coming in from soccer just because soccer is a little bit more subjective. Whereas swimming, as you know, they don't have to see you do it. It's like, what was your time? What place did you come at? You know, junior national, senior national meet, and what's your time? Okay, great. You're good enough to swim here. And so the objectivity of swimming in the recruitment phase, that's kind of a turning point. You can't really play 2 Division I sports. A few people, I know some people do, but it's rare. And that's what turned me. It wasn't like, and I will say there was a lot of times through then swimming, which turned into triathlon, which turned into adventure, where I was like, man, I miss having scoring a goal and diving in big hug with all your buddies and your teammates. Like there's nothing like that. And swimming just doesn't have that. So I think you're steering your kids in a good direction for sure.
Well, I hope I'm not depriving them of the tools needed for a life of adventure. Okay. So, here is another, and if you'll bear with me through this, and I don't talk about this very much, but it's apropos to the conversation. So there are ways in which our lives have shown some parallels. Sports, the particular sports we've chosen. I wish I had been an adventurer instead of just reading books about Shackleton or Kingdom of Ice by Hampton Sides. But I do have this particular experience, but I have it from a different vantage point than you. So when my son was almost 3, he pulled a crock pot full of meat sauce off of the kitchen counter, and he burned himself over 7% of his body. Mm-hmm. They don't do this anymore, and I don't know what year, you mentioned it earlier, you were burned, but They don't call it third degree, but whatever they call it now, it's the equivalent of what we popularly know of as third degree burns. In the hospital for, a month, does the whole skin graft thing and everything. And by the way, this was a good 10 years ago. So he's good. He's got a few battle scars to show for it. He avoided, by the grace of God, his face. But I know what it's like to be on the other side of that bed, and I know your mom played an integral role in this story that is really part of the beginning of your life of adventure. You did all of the things we're talking about after having suffered. I don't know how deep your burns were, but it looks to me from the pictures I've seen over a vast percentage of your body, your lower legs, and that is what happened before you decided to walk across Antarctica or summit these mountains.
Yeah. No. Well, first of all, I have all the empathy and love for anyone who's been through a burn accident, either as a victim or someone as a parent who's caring for that. Because for whatever reason, growing up, you think about broken bones or scrapes or whatever, but burn, man, it's got to be one of the worst, if not the worst, kind of injury to have. The skin, it's the largest organ in our body, and infection and all the complications that come with that. The treatment
is sometimes more. The treatment is worse and more torturous than the original injury.
Yeah, the debridement. They're scrubbing it. All the different things are happening. So I had severe second degree and third degree burns. I don't know if they've changed the terminology now, like you said, but I got burned in 2008. So probably similar era, so to speak, of medical care as your son. But I was in rural Thailand. That's sort of the kicker of the whole situation. So after college, didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid, but I saved up painting houses and said, before I get my quote unquote real job, I want to go bum around the world for a second. Eat peanut butter jelly sandwiches, surfboard, backpack, sleep on floors, hitchhike, try to live off $10 a day in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So that's what I did. And the first stop was great. I got a free layover on my student fare, super cheap ticket to New Zealand. It stopped in Fiji for a week, and I actually met my wife there in 2007 on a tiny little island in Fiji. She was on a study abroad program in Australia. She's American, but she was studying over there. And here we are 15 years later together. So in that sense, the trip was a win. In terms of it not being a win, or certainly a turning point, was I found myself on this small beach in rural Thailand, 22 years old, no fully formed prefrontal cortex. And I see some guys jumping a flaming jump rope, and I think to myself, gee, that looks like some fun. And so I go in there, a little double dutch, a little jump the old flaming jump rope, and in an instant, my life changed. There was excess kerosene on the rope, it turned out. It tripped me, wrapped around my legs, but then it got worse because the excess kerosene splattered my body, and then that ignited my clothes all the way up to my neck. Fortunately, I was, 10, 15 steps away from the ocean, so, kind of survival mode kicked in. I jumped into the ocean to extinguish the flames, which certainly saved my life, but not before about 25% of my body, predominantly my legs, feet, were severely burned. And to make matters worse, as I said, I'm in Thailand. I'm actually in rural Thailand. I'm in an island on the Gulf of Thailand. There's no, instead of an ambulance ride, I have a moped ride down a dirt path to a one-room nursing station. I undergo 8 surgeries in a various of, kind of rudimentary hospitals. There's a cat running around my bed and across my chest in this makeshift ICU. I mean, it's not where you want to be. And people that don't know about burns, it really is. It's a bad, physically painful injury, but also infections are high risk in this. But you sound like a legend for being the dad to care for your son in this. In my case, it was my mother who, honestly changed the trajectory of my life. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, which is, I can only imagine she gets there day 4 or day 5. It's how long it takes her to literally find me and track me down and get to the middle of nowhere in Thailand, where I am from Oregon. And she finds me there in this horrible state, physical pain. And the day before that, the doctor had walked in. He looked me in the eyes. He's trying to be honest. He's just doing his job. And he's like, hey, Colin, I hate to tell you this, but you'll probably never walk again normally. And the way I had been burned was so badly burned, so deep, but also the ligaments and the tissues in my ankles and my knee joints. I just thought I would never regain the full mobility of my legs. So I'm this athlete, right? This self-identity. I'm an athlete. I'm physical. My body. It's a terrible diagnosis for anyone, but it's like me, young man. I got my whole life in front of me, and like, you're never going to walk again normally, you idiot. You did this to yourself. I just get into the deepest, darkest place in my mind ever. I'm just beating myself up from every single angle. Depression, anxiety, fear, all the things, not to mention the physical pain. And my mom admits to me now that when she found me, she broke down in tears with the doctors in the hallway. She's crying. She's sobbing. We're in this place trying to talk to these doctors. There's a language barrier. I mean, it's just a bad situation. But she never showed me her own fear. My mom's insane. Like, she came in and literally with a smile on her face, not trying to pretend like this wasn't a bad situation. She was clear about that. But going, hey, your life's not over. What do you want to do when you get out of here? Let's set a goal. She's like, let's visualize. Let's think about a brighter future after that. You're going to get through this. Like, let's talk. And I was like, Mom, stop with the, like, you know, positivity BS. Like, my life is over as I know it. I now call, and I frame it in the book, this concept that I call a possible mindset, which I think is basically what I say you'll get on the other side of the 12-hour walk. You'll let go of these limiting beliefs and gain this possible mindset, which I define as an empowered way of thinking that unlocks a life of limitless possibilities. My mom is encouraging me in the depths of despair to dream without limits. And she goes, picture something. Close your eyes and just call in, picture something. I close my eyes. And she sees a little smile come across my face. She said, what'd you see? I said, oh, this probably sounds ridiculous, but I saw myself crossing the finish line of a triathlon. And she could have easily said, I did say set a goal, but like you're, the doctor and your waist, you're bandaged from the waist down, and maybe pick a different goal. But instead she goes, great. In fact, I can already see you crossing the finish line. She goes, hey, Doc, I need you to bring in some weights. And the doc's like, what? What are you talking about? Bring in some weights, from the gym or whatever in the hospital. My son's training for a triathlon. So I have these pictures, are ridiculous. There's a Thai doctor in a white lab coat staring at me like I'm out of my freaking mind. And my waist is bandaged, a white gauze from the waist down to my feet. And I'm pumping these weights going, Doc, I'm training for a triathlon. And he's like, dude, this kid is out of his freaking mind. But it was my mom encouraging me. And you fast forward that story, a couple months in the Thai hospital. I was, in a wheelchair. I was, carried on and off the plane. I was in a wheelchair when I got back to Portland, Oregon. My mom literally had to, help me walk one step at a time. But I eventually started walking, and I could, jog a tiny bit, and I honored that goal. I took a job in Chicago, and I signed up for the Chicago Triathlon just 18 months after being told I would never walk again normally. I find myself at the start line of the Chicago Triathlon, and I race the race. I, swim the mile. I ride my bike 25 miles down Lakeshore Drive, get my running shoes on, run 6.2 miles, crossing the finish line. I had done it. I had honored this goal. But there was one, bigger surprise in store for me that day, which I hadn't just finished the race. I actually won the entire Chicago Triathlon, placing first at about 5,000 people. And when I think back on that moment, it's the ones and the tens, right? Like, this was an obvious one. I mean, an obvious lowest of low. And more importantly than the momentary high of, holy shit, I did the triathlon, or even I won the triathlon, it was more like, you know what? What would have happened had my mom not come in there and helped me switch my mindset? Where would I be today? And you're very kind to say this and point out, I have set 10 world records, not before I did this stupid thing and jumped the flaming jump rope. I did that after that. Which means when I reflect on that, not just me, all of us as humans, I believe we all have reservoirs of untapped potential inside of us to achieve extraordinary things, to find fulfillment, to find inner strength, to conjure that possible mindset. Hence, the 12-hour walk is the prescription for that. But I wonder what would have happened. And my mom, in my lowest moment, in my lowest moment in my young life at that point, she taught me one of life's most valuable lessons, which is, no matter what you're facing, you have an opportunity to reframe it, shift it, build, and come back stronger.
What an awesome story. I have to ask for my own personal curiosity. So how long were you, 25% of your body, how long were you in the hospital in Thailand?
So I was in the hospital, a series of hospitals for the first 8 or 9 days, literally a shack, and then this really rudimentary hospital on an adjacent island. And then on the 8th day, I believe 8th or 9th day, I was loaded into a medical airplane. My body was way too unstable to go back to the U.S., but I was flown to Bangkok. Then I was in this Bangkok hospital. I don't know the exact count, 5-6 weeks, something like that, in this Bangkok hospital. And then finally stable enough, still bandaged, still gauzed up, flown back to the United States immediately before even going home. Went to the burn unit in Oregon, where actually I fortunately was an outpatient at that point, but I was back and forth between the burn center and the occupational therapist and all of that for, almost every single day for several months. I mean, it's man, the burn is a long road to recovery. It's brutal.
Yeah. Did you have to wear I know you had to, I'm sure. So
compression.
You said you did the triathlon 18 months later. I feel like My son wore the compression suit for a year after the incident. Did you have to wear that? Was it for a year?
Yeah, so about a year. My legs couldn't see the sun for a long time. I would, if I don't know if it's happened to your son, but if I would like even tap into a chair or something like that, immediately I'd get a cut. I mean, the skin is like, it grows back, but then it's like the thinnest, it's like paper thin. There's a story that I tell briefly in the book, a quick little anecdote. It's like, I'm trying to get out of my parents' basement, move on with my life. I apply for my first like real job. I fly in to take this job interview, and I look in the mirror and I'm taking the elevator up, and it's like this 6 months or maybe 9 months after. I'm still kind of limping around, but I'm trying to regain my autonomy, right? My independence, get on with my life. And I look in the mirror, crisp white shirt, collared shirt, and it's a finance job. I got a tie on, trying to look real nice, whatever. And then I can't help but look down, like I'm wearing fluffy slippers. Like I haven't been able to wear shoes for so long. My feet were actually some of the worst, particularly my left feet. And I'm like, okay, like it just like this moment of like, it just like, okay, what am I going to do here? Like the head of the trading firm comes out, meets me in the lobby, and it's like, oh, hello, happy to have you for the interview. And it's like, looks at me. You can't help but he's got to have this look on his face. Like, what the hell? I mean, what, and of course I tell him the story and we move past it. Unfortunately, he offers me the job, but it's just one of those things like, do you want to get on with your life? I was desperate to get on with my life. Right. But also it's like you say, it's a long, your son's wearing that for a year. It's like, it's not just like a quick fix. You can like hide it. It's like, I can't wear shoes, man. I was like, hey, I love this job. I'm going to show up for the first 3 months wearing, Uggs. Is that cool? So. Oh man. And
you mentioned it, and however you say it, debridement, it's the worst. That's essentially the doctor's using a metal sponge to wipe away burnt skin to try to find healthy skin. And I can't imagine, man, we were in New York City at the height of medical care, and you're in some island in Thailand going through this. Look, it's emotionally, and I've lost parents to tragedy. I've been through a few things in my life, but it is emotionally the most difficult thing I've ever been through, and it didn't happen to me. I was simply the parent in the equation. So I feel for your mom. I wish I could say I know what you went through, but I know what you went through was terrible, and I feel for your mom. And I do find it just this, it is, as you just laid out, such an integral part of your story.
Yeah, well, my mom and you could have a lot to talk about, I'm sure, because I think her road to recovery may have just been just as long as mine as well. Just going through that as a parent, I can only imagine.
Well, all of these stories break down in the book, The 12-Hour Walk, and it breaks down into this mindset you just laid out, the possible mindset versus limiting beliefs. And you're laying out for us all the things you have done, you've pushed, and you've accomplished in overcoming your limiting beliefs and what you've found, how you've used that positive mindset through the process. And you're encouraging us to now take this 12-hour walk to try to experience the same path in one day. So I said, I will do it. Everybody should check out the 12-Hour Walk book. And I'm going to ask you just one last question. These seem to be lessons that you have learned, I'm going to assume to some extent, on the back end or in the process of all of these accomplishments. But I'm curious why you have set out on all of these adventures in the first place. What is it in you? Why cross the Drake Passage? Why hike across Antarctica? Why climb Everest? Why set these world records?
Yeah, 100%. And the book, like you said, it lays out these stories in rich narrative format and in ways that are digestible for people to relate in their own life. But to be clear, it's not my hero of my journey. I say in the book explicitly, I'm not the hero of the story. You're the hero of the story. And this is showing me it'd be easy for me to write a book and be like, and then I was on the top of Everest again, and then I high-fived my buddies on the Drake Passage, and just kind of skip over the bad parts. What I actually show in this book is me going through all of the same limiting beliefs and learning these lessons the hard way by falling and failing and getting scraped up and lighting myself on fire and all the nitty gritty in between. So it's vulnerable from that standpoint, because it'd be easier to be like, and look at me, the conquering hero who done these things. And that's not the truth. I don't think that's really the truth of anyone's story, but there's still beauty in the challenge, right? But why? One question I get asked a lot that it's at least in my mind right now similar to this is, are you afraid of dying? People think you take all these risks. Like, why would you do this? Aren't you afraid of dying? And I've thought about that a lot. And I certainly have a fear of that. I have experienced death up close with friends in intense situations in expeditions I write about in the book. But although I don't have a death wish, although I don't think of myself as this thrill-seeking adrenaline junkie, what I'm actually the most afraid of than anything is not living. Meaning, I want to experience the full tapestry of life. I don't think I'm taking undue risk to put myself out there, but my why, again, my campus is the ends of the earth and mountaintops, and I love pushing myself that way. But I'm more afraid of a life of constant fives, a life just stuck in that zone of comfortable complacency, not living the full tapestry of life, than I am of the other eventualities. And so for me, that's what it's like. I want to live a life full of experiences that aren't just this. My next Everest, I say at the end of the book, is to inspire 10 million people to take the 12-hour walk. It's not just, I should write a book about it. It's like, no, I'm passionate about that. I'm passionate about my wife, my family, my relationships, the businesses I've started, the different things creative explorations. People want to talk about what I'm doing in these expeditions. There's other interests. There's other, passions of mine, but they all come from the same place, which is I want to live, and I want to live fully.
I love that. Live a life of ones and tens. Avoid the fives and sixes, and find your Everest. And go take a 12-hour walk, and maybe you will find that Everest. And check out the book, 12-Hour Walk. Colin, this has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate all the time you've given me. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.